Hello, I'm Heather Downing with the Okta Developer Advocate Team. Have you moved into a new house lately and just want to automate all the things? I know I personally have, and this is one of my favorite topics, IoT, or Internet of Things. Sounds pretty cool, right? Just one tiny concern. How secure is it really to use smart home devices? Well, since I work at a company that really values privacy, I figured I'd take some of what Okta has to offer to heart. The world of IoT has so many options, but very little guidance on how secure they are and what you can do about that. So in this session, we're going to go over what you can do with existing platforms like your Nest or Google Assistant, Alexa, Ecobee, etc., but also what you can do if you decide to roll your own DIY project with some existing ecosystems, but maybe ones you write yourself. The point to all of this is the one who can lock all this stuff down is you, as the developer. So let's get into the problem. Let's just pick one to start with. How about we talk about the vulnerabilities that security cameras can have, specifically if they're connected to the internet. IoT security cameras are used extensively by industry and, of course, the critical infrastructure sector. I'm talking about transportation, city surveillance, public places, and utility companies. These areas specifically, not including homeowners, are expected to grow with their use of security cameras at the highest rate over the next 4 years. If you want to think about the financial market cap of that, you're moving from 45 billion to 74 billion by 2025 alone. Given the prevalence and the exponential use of IoT cameras, it's important to understand their security risks. Over the last 6 months, according to Security Boulevard and Nozomi Networks, they discovered and disclosed 3 separate surveillance camera vulnerabilities for companies that use peer-to-peer functionality to provide access to those video and audio feeds. Additionally, Security Boulevard reported an IoT security camera cyber attack that resulted in unauthorized access to the live video feeds of 150,000 cameras and their full video archive of surveillance. That's a pretty big deal. So knowing that, then really I should think twice about putting something like that in my house, right? I guess the big point I'm trying to make is IoT devices can help, but they can also hurt. I just got my first house recently, and as somebody who lives by herself, it's really important to me that I have an additional set of eyes and ears for the areas of the house that I'm not in, especially if I'm away for a little while. I like to keep an eye on things. So selecting what camera system I wanted to use and whether or not I wanted to roll my own was very important. Most of these devices are kind of insecure by default. They have gotten a little bit better, but it's still kind of an issue. Because at the end of the day, when you go into your local store or think of buying something on Amazon, nobody really thinks about how secure any of these items are, just how cool they are. But that really needs to change. There's another problem when it comes to just trying to set things up in your house. So let's move away from cameras and start talking about more fun devices like colored lights. So there could be a lot of things you can leverage. Obviously, Philips Hue offers some of the earlier options. But when it comes to what is available now online, there's a plethora. My good friend Troy Hunt recently installed a lot of different lights all over his house. And he used 2 different kinds. He used one that required a remote access, meaning that it really had to be turned on by a function that lived on a cloud server somewhere. And so there's latency inherently involved with that, right? It needs to go all the way up and then all the way back down. Whereas he also had installed some lights that provided a local switch. So clearly the latency was a lot more apparent. That's not necessarily something that some developers think about when it comes to access to have even being able to get to the internet. What happens when you have a power outage? So do you not have any way of turning on your device or even turning it off? For me, this kind of came to a head because I live in the Midwest and we have all sorts of thunderstorms and lightning strikes. And quite often, my energy company, unfortunately, will kind of shut our grid off. Well, if I'm on vacation and I shut that off, the cameras that I had selected specifically for my downstairs area would not restart unless you physically put the plug out and then plugged it back in. That's just the way it's set up. There is no other way to do it. So there are definitely some problems that are inherent when you get into this that you just never thought about when you're building a website. If you're interested a little bit more in what Troy is talking about and the mess that Internet of Things can sometimes be, check out his blog. Troy has lots to say on the topic of IoT. The reality is, IoT is not going to go away. It's here to stay for many of the sectors that I mentioned earlier. It's so crucial for safety and accessibility. While IoT is improving, it's certainly not perfect, and you should have a zero trust approach. Zero trust meaning, by default, you shouldn't trust anything. That's how all of your devices should be set up. It can definitely make it more of a challenge, especially when you're trying to share, for example, access to something with somebody else. But there are options out there, I promise. There are good existing smart home ecosystems you can absolutely leverage for a lot of the projects you want to build. And remember, some of those devices need to be physically replugged at times. So see if there's a way that you can select some ecosystems that are a little bit better about the restart phase. However, for that reason, it's not uncommon for developers to have to DIY their way through this, especially if you have something very specific that you need to have done. Now let's go over some basic things that you can do to work with IoT ecosystems for improved security. What do I mean by IoT ecosystems? Well, there are quite a few in existence, as you can see right here. I personally work with every single one. I would say if you're a developer getting started, Amazon Alexa provides the easiest way to extend their existing ecosystem and enhance it with specific types of skills. But you can really use this with almost any of them, or completely codeless if you want. Let's start with a couple of things you can do before you get into pounding away at the code that don't really matter how good your code is if you don't set things up for success on your network. Let's start with changing your wireless name and password. Having a default network name is kind of like a big sign. It says, hey, if you Google this and advertise that, I bet I could find out what the answer is to your default username. Makes you a pretty big target. The best way to go about fixing this issue is to make sure you change your network name to something that you can recognize, but that isn't very informative. For example, saying pretty fly for a Wi-Fi is great, but John Smith's Wi-Fi is not. Try not to put any sort of personal information or like your house number identified in there. Change your router's admin name and password. Yet again, when you pull it out of the box and you set your router up, unless it has a secure app to set it up like Google Wi-Fi or something, it's going to have a default username and password set up to log in and change your Wi-Fi settings. Yes, even now. If you don't ever plan on changing your Wi-Fi network name or password after you set it up, you should still change your admin username and password anyway. And I'd recommend storing that in a password manager, especially if the password manager can generate something that is stronger and more secure. So it's accessible, but still secure should you need to change those Wi-Fi settings. Before you forward ports to and from your IoT devices, it's really important to understand what you're forwarding, why you're doing it, and whether it's actually necessary for the function. There is a lot to know about ports and forwarding, but the important part, for at least brevity's sake, is that it effectively sets a rule that says if traffic comes through the door for this IP address, go ahead and send it through. This is, of course, an oversimplification, but you understand how this can probably compromise you sometimes. The key to this is only forwarding ports that you know are necessary, and you should know why they're necessary and for what. Don't forget to monitor your network. I was terrible about this until recently. You don't need to monitor it 24/7, but keeping a good eye on it, becoming familiar with it, and knowing what it is can be an important factor here. If you know everybody in the room, spotting an intruder is a lot easier, especially when it comes to traffic. So over time, as you add more IoT devices in your smart home, you will notice how much data they consume, how often, what time of day. You'll kind of tend to understand which addresses are contacting them to go back and forth through any sort of cloud server, right? So you're probably going to be able to keep an eye out a little bit better if you're familiar with what is normal. Remember, there are no rules unless you set them. Set up rules for your network. Do you know of every device that will connect to it? Check to see if your network supports MAC filtering. This can be a little time consuming to set up. I had help with mine because of my router, but this basically means only devices listed by unique physical IDs are able to connect. If you don't have a lot of guests that are trying to access a particular network or do not intend to allow guests to be able to access it, this can be a very good way and hands-off way of strengthening your network security. Now that we've gone over the basics of at least what you should have in place, let's talk about some help for you as a developer. If you decide to do a DIY project, you can, again, extend platforms like something like Home Assistant to simplify your routine. So you don't have to write all of it from scratch, maybe just some of the functionality, right? So let's say you do extend that. Then what? Let's say you extend maybe a Google Assistant skill. Well, in order to secure it, you really should use OAuth. Now, there are a lot of different ways, of course, to secure something, but at least using an OAuth protocol will help immensely, right? Obviously, Okta and Auth0 both make this pretty easy. I have an example of a couple of Alexa skills that I've done directly on our blog. You should definitely try just doing a basic proof of concept so you understand the flow. When it comes to this, you're probably going to have yourself or your users use their phone in order to at least initially connect to these devices to handle the OAuth flow. You need something with a screen and the ability to give input. That definitely will help when it comes to something knocking on the door and trying to take over control of your blinds going up and down. Design your devices to work manually and locally in addition to their remote control. So remember the power outage thing that I talked about earlier. If the developers of that camera had just put something in place for me to be able to turn it off and on in more than one way, it probably would have been a lot easier to handle. This is something, though, that most developers don't think about when you're just trying to control a device like this. Have an ability locally to turn something on as well. Have your IoT devices do really one thing well. Start with that. Secure it all the way. Do the entire thing. And then go ahead and add additional functionality. Because if you try to put a bunch in it, it's going to be a little bit of a nightmare to try and secure, because there's probably one or two things that it's doing that you didn't think about and could possibly cause a vulnerability to your system. And please build your software like a door that is not only shut, but locked by default. Zero trust. If you take nothing else away from this talk, I want you to take that. It's a different way of thinking for sure, but lots of our companies have been doing that from the beginning. And your home should be the same way. Zero trust by default. I mean, I wanted to get to the point where I can just walk up to a door and it automatically senses who I am and it opens. But then you get in all sorts of Minority Report level conspiracy theories of what our future looks like in somebody trying to break into your house or at least get your data. But most of the attacks that happen are because somebody just didn't set up their Wi-Fi router properly, didn't even bother securing their device and just put out a public API. It's even worse to be able to control the video feed of something. And while it's super exciting in the world of IoT to be able to automate all the things, you have to start with not trusting anything in order to feel confident about things being operable in your home especially. There's also an opportunity now that you know a little bit about the vulnerabilities. Jump in with securing an existing IoT system for the first time that you do any of this, just so you have a little bit quicker return on your time and investment. Treat it like any other front-end website that you want to add user login to, and extending some of those ecosystems make it easier. That's the whole reason that some of these companies created their assistant platforms, is specifically for this purpose, instead of handling every single thing. It also makes it easier to wrap your mind around the process and the different points in that you could tweak for yourself. Some of it is at the hardware level, but actually a lot of the key things here are at the software level. Don't be afraid to try just a simple project, right? Just in case you want to explore something that's more secure. Let's say you don't trust one of these systems and you're totally well within your right to feel that way. Data privacy is a big deal, right? When you try something very, very simple, we're going to take the lights, for example, it forces you to make key decisions, which is more limited maybe in an existing ecosystem than what perhaps you could come up with. Rolling your own IoT forces you to make all of those decisions. There's actually a really good article about how you would go about creating the decision trees inside of an IoT rules engine. If you're interested in that, I've got the link right here. It's specifically on IoTs for All's website, and I found it to be really interesting. You know, how are they used? Should you use decision trees to model complex logic? What about uncertainty? Should you use a rules engine that is already set up that way? Should you use sentiment analysis? Should you use AI-based engines? Do you have to roll all of that yourselves? How easy is it to operate? All of those questions can be answered on that blog post. It's highly recommended reading. And of course, join a developer community, especially around IoT. Stack Overflow is full of these people, but they kind of exist everywhere. If you have a chance, you might run into a few at a local maker fair, meaning lots of hardware meets software kind of events. They're both online and in person, and people are automating all sorts of really cool things. This is a very exciting space, and while it is very useful for enterprise level, this can also be super fun. Consider following a few video platform channels. Look up Lars Klint, and I'm sure that you will find a lot of interesting projects to watch him do in his smart home transformation in Australia, for example. IoT, of course, is not just limited to a smart home. Scott Hanselman uses a device that I guess would also be considered an IoT device to monitor his glucose levels as a diabetic. There's a lot of really crucial things that can happen in the IoT device world. And while I was kind of focusing a little bit more on how you can use them in your home, these concepts can also apply very broadly. Big bonus here is an opportunity to learn this and be highly employable. And of course, having your home more secure. Given the existing IoT capabilities, focusing on technologies and providing a quick response to security will be very, very simple. Long-term security and management requirements are always on the minds of IoT experts. Regulators are interested in developing a mechanism that will allow IoT product developers to address this issue if any cybersecurity measure fails or they aren't really passing certain muster. IoT is going to be everywhere, just like tech is everywhere. There isn't a tech industry so much because every company is a tech company now. Every company needs a website. Every company needs some type of identity management. It will be the same, that there will be IoT devices probably in most every industry in the future. So this is a very employable skill. You should absolutely just look into it enough and then add it to your resume. There's a lot of people out there looking for you to fill that role. And what better way to start than do a pet project at your home, because you understand what's at stake. You're not just building something for fun where the stakes are low. This is your house. This is your home. This is where you live. And you will inherently treat that with more care. And because you're doing that, that approach is definitely a skill set employers are looking for. Making IoT devices acceptably secure rests with you, the developer. I'm not afraid to use smart devices throughout my home because I understand how they work and how to mitigate the vulnerabilities that they could present. So the next time somebody tells me that Alexa is listening, I will smile and say, well, I hope so. I told her to. That's kind of the idea. Data privacy is critical to be owned by you in as many places as possible, however. If you aren't cool with an existing system, you can absolutely benefit from remote automation in your home by building and securing it completely yourself. You don't have to rely on those, but knowing that they exist that can make things easier is definitely a plus. It used to be a lot more complex to just put up some basic automation than it is today. So most of the basic use cases you need, like video surveillance, there's probably an existing option for you that you just want to plug into and perhaps programmatically change certain times of day that things occur, but not much more. You can definitely do a whole lot more if you wanted to. Now that you're fully aware of the risks and rewards of having smart home automation, I want to know what kinds of things you want to put together to make your life easier, right? So send me a message on Twitter. I'm at Coraline, or a quick email to heather.downing@okta.com. And please tell me what your idea is. And as always, stay curious.